Good to go. I think in our brief conversation before we started this morning, I think we have the feeling. We have the feeling of what was moving in me yesterday and moving in me today. And especially as I look over out the window and I see the trees dancing in the wind and the sunlight reflecting, and it's just a glorious day to be alive, a gorgeous day to be alive, to be here, to be able to appreciate it all. So the idea of abundance, an abundant universe, this idea of abundance is particularly easy for us to grasp in the fall, because the fall is traditionally a time of, in our part of the world, a time of gathering the harvest, a time of bringing the crops and the animals in from the field, of preparing the surplus, preserving it for the long winter to come, taking the best 10% and setting it aside for the seed stock, for the breeding stock, to prepare for the future. This is where the idea of tithing came from, setting aside the best 10% for God, the first 10%. There's something about this time of the year when it's easy for us to look, to observe, and to understand some of these laws that different teachers talk about over the years. The law of multiplication. The reason that 10% of the seed was enough was because when we put the seeds in the ground, they get multiplied tenfold. If you want 100 bushels of corn next year, if you plant 10, it will be multiplied tenfold. Nature knows how to do that all on its own. And I love, the children are just absolutely an inspiration to helping us all, I think, to just really appreciate the simple things in life and the joyful things in life. And I love the pumpkin patches at this time of the year. When we lived in Wilmington, those of you who are in Wilmington probably know where I'm talking about. As you're heading up College Road from Carolina Beach, when you get up near where Wrightsville Avenue crosses up there, near kind of in the vicinity where the Unity is, there's a big Methodist church over on the right. I don't remember the name of it, but every year there's a traffic light there, and every year they had a huge pumpkin patch for the kids. And I think it was impossible to go up College Road without having to stop for that light, for the cross traffic. And it was a wonderful opportunity to look over and watch the little ones, And there were pumpkins everywhere, pumpkins of all sizes, of all shapes, all kinds of pumpkins. And the little ones would run around, and there'd be a couple of them together, In my mind, they were a little family, brothers and sisters, and they were running about, and they were trying to find the absolute perfect pumpkin to take home and to carve out and make a jack-o'-lantern and put on their porch, And they would run to one, and one of them would call and say, "Hey, come over here and look at this one," At least that's the way I imagined it. And then they would all come over and they would look at it, and then one would run off in another direction and call them all, and you just watch them, and they would just run from pumpkin to pumpkin to pumpkin, until they finally found it. They found the one that spoke to them, their pumpkin, the one that called to them, And then Mommy and Daddy would come over, and they would kind of look down and nod their heads, and somebody would pick up the pumpkin, and they would go pay for it. It's just so precious to be able to just sit there in whatever it takes for a traffic light, 90 seconds or so, to just sit there, and instead of being caught up in driving and traffic and all those things, to just see this joyful time of life as the children were celebrating the abundance of the pumpkins. How many were there? How many different sizes? How many different shapes? I looked up on the internet last night, where of course everything you read must be true, but it said that the world's largest pumpkin, I think, came from Belgium, and it was like 2,246 pounds or something like that. Over a ton. How does this tiny little seed, if you when you carve in your pumpkin with the children this year, or if you have memories of carving pumpkins with the children, You see how small the pumpkin seeds are. And how many of them are in one pumpkin, just in one pumpkin. You can't count all the seeds that are in that one pumpkin. There's an abundance of seeds in the pumpkin. And yet it's a tiny little seed. But it can grow into something that is over a ton. And that one little pumpkin, if you took all of those seeds out, and you planted all of those seeds, and each seed produced a vine, and each vine produced several pumpkins, you can see how they would multiply. You can see, that there's something inherent in their nature to increase and to multiply, I think, to put it in biblical terms. And it's just amazing to think about that. And I have to ask myself, when we look at that, there's a couple of lessons in that for us to think about. Remember, we've been talking for the last several weeks, this theme has been kind of flowing in and out of the Sunday talks. And there's a couple of ideas that have just kind of been working through there and working in there. And maybe they're the same essential ideas, primordial ideas or themes, I don't know, that work through everything. And one idea is unconsciousness. Remember, the only sin is the sin of unconsciousness. We're not awake, we're not alive, we're not paying attention to the magnificence of what divine love is, what God is in its creation, as its creation, through its creation. The miracle of the pumpkin. We're unconscious, and most importantly, we're unconscious to our own true nature. Our own, what are we? How did we get here? Where are we going? Why are we here? All of these really important questions in life that we tend to divert and ignore, and like Gone with the Wind, we won't worry about those today, we'll worry about those tomorrow. But those are the essence of life. Those are the important questions in life. Everything else turns to dust. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? We're largely unconscious to that. And our spiritual growth then is an awakening from that sleep. And I love the way Joel Goldsmith puts it. He says, if you go back and you read Genesis, you read the beginning of the Bible as we know it in our culture, the Old Testament we call it, in the book of Genesis, there's a part in there where God puts Adam into a deep sleep. Remember, Adam says he's lonesome and he doesn't have a mate, and God puts Adam into a deep sleep. And nowhere in the Bible does it tell us that Adam woke up. And Goldsmith asks us to consider we're all still in that sleep. We're all still in that Adam dream, that everything else that happens after that we should consider to be a dream. And what we are trying to do as we are becoming more aware of who and what we are as spiritual beings, we are shaking off that dream. We are shaking off the illusion of that dream. It's like if you've ever been under anesthesia for any reason, and you're trying to come out of it, and you're groggy, and you can't quite grasp what's going on, and you're trying to come out of it, and you're slipping back into it. You're trying to come out of it. It's almost like you're fighting your way out. It's almost like a boxer trying to punch his way out. We're fighting for consciousness. We're fighting to come back into a state of awareness. And I think it's kind of a good analogy for us in our spiritual growth. We're awakening. We are awakening. People asked the Buddha, who are you? And his response was, I'm awake. I'm awake. We are awakening. We are awakening to the spiritual truth. We are awakening to our spiritual nature. We are awakening from that dream, from that illusion. And part of that awakening from unconsciousness, the unconsciousness of our true nature, is breaking identification, right? Misidentification. We identify with the physical. We identify with the common ways that things work, and the common things, the things that people tell us, the things our parents told us, the things our Sunday school teachers told us. There's a way in which the world works, a human way in which the world works, and human beings have created that way. They have created that way. We have to keep that in mind. The governments that we see, the commerce, the businesses that we see, the laws that we see, the rules of trade that we see, the rules of currency that we see. This idea of buying and selling and using paper money, fiat money as a currency. These are all human ideas. These are all human constructs. They're not the absolute. They're just sort of agreements that human beings have made. You know, either implicitly sitting down, negotiating, signing contracts, or just by going along with the way things work. So we tend to identify then with external things. We tend to identify with appearances and not so much with internal things. Our science is more interested in what we can see out there, what we can weigh, what we can measure, what we can touch, what we can feel. And yet it has spent relatively little time trying to determine who is it that's looking? What is it that's looking? So our growth is not only an awakening from the unconsciousness of not realizing who and what we are. It is a way of deliberately breaking our identification with the human, with the ego, with the I. I read something yesterday that was just kind of one of those things that kind of jumps out at you. And there's this human struggle that we go through about we have to make it happen. We have to do it. There has to be activity in order for something to change. And all of that is true. But when we feel that we are the one doing it, then we're coming from the place of ego. We're studying the Tao in the Wednesday night group, and there's a saying in the Tao where they call it Wu Wei, doing perfect non-doing, and I'm going to paraphrase, and of course there's many translations, but it's something to the effect that he who can do perfect non-doing can do everything. It sounds nonsensical to us. How can you do everything if you do non-doing? And to me, it's this idea of letting go of the sense of I am doing it, my ego. I am making it happen. I'm going to go in there and set this up and organize this and do this and do that. And that's what we identify with. That's the way that the world works, you know. Those who are doers, those who their primary orientation towards life is to just simply look at something and take action, they tend to rise to the top because everybody likes to see stuff done. And if somebody else is going to do it, they're going to let them do it. And what happens is they tend to create organizations based on the way they see the world. They tend to create societies the way that they see the world. And that's only one way. That's only one way of seeing the world. So what we want to consider then is that as we are awakening from our unconsciousness, we are also losing the identity of self that was associated with the ego I, with the I am Jim I. And there's activity, and there's action, and there's doing, but it is more a flowing from our nature. It is more a consequence of our being than it is an act of will or domination or force or manipulation or control or all those things. See, I think we kind of missed the boat a little bit. There's another part in Genesis where it says that God gave Adam and Eve dominion over all of the creatures. And people today take that to mean that, well, we can do what we want with the creatures. They're ours to use. They're just a resource for us to treat any way we want. And I think it's more subtle than that. It's more subtle than that. We do have dominion, and we can do what we want, but not without consequence. But not without consequence. And what the creatures are, and what all of nature is, and what we are, is what we have decided to make them in our consciousness. That is the dominion we have. They are what we believe them to be. And we've set up a struggle then, we've set up a barrier, even with our own nature. And that we're not necessarily learning how to be one with things or to be one with ourselves as much as our societies have set themselves up to. How do I control? How do I control these things? How do I control these people? How do I control the farm animals? How do I control the crops? How do I control the rivers, And yet that within us, which can perfectly do non-doing, is at one with all of these creatures. So if our idea of dominion were to shift from we have the power to control because God gave it to us, if that idea became we have the power to experience our oneness because we all come from the same place, it would be a whole different world, a whole different world. So when we come to this time of the year, when we come to fall and we come to see the abundance of nature, this is a perfect time for us to reflect upon whether or not we as individuals in our process of awakening from our unconsciousness, in our process of breaking our identification of the human way of looking at things, do we see ourselves as part of nature, as part of that abundance, as that abundance being a natural, normal part of our own lives? Or do we see ourselves as witnesses to it, observers of it? And while it may come easily to nature, it has to come, the experience of abundance that is, has to come as a struggle to the human. That's our opportunity. That's our opportunity. So if we stop and think about nature, now if we could think of nature as it exists before human consciousness gets involved, before human consciousness starts to label things and judge things and weigh things and measure things and try to control things, if we think of nature kind of pristine, and then think of human nature as being kind of pristine, right? The undifferentiated mind, or the unconditioned mind, perhaps, as the Buddhists might call it, we can see that abundance is quite natural. we can see that in nature things know how to multiply in a manner that is more than enough. And in other words, there's enough to grow. There's enough to sustain, and then there's enough to grow. We look at that tiny little seed of the pumpkin, and we take that tiny little seed of the pumpkin and we put it in the soil. And when the conditions are right, and the pumpkin seed knows when the conditions are right, when the conditions are right, it will germinate. And when it germinates, it'll send up the sprout, and then they will put out vines. The pumpkins grow on vines. And usually when we planted them, you would plant them in a hill, like beans. That's where the saying, a hill of beans, comes from. You would put up a little mound of dirt, and you would put maybe a half a dozen or so seeds in there, and you would have vines coming out every which way, And then the flowers would come, and then the fruit would come. And you have to ask yourself, well, how does the seed know when it is to germinate? How does it know when to do that? That knowledge is already in there. That wisdom is already in there. It's probably not a conscious thought like you or I. We can't imagine a little cartoon seed sitting down there going, is it time yet? Is it time yet? Is it time yet? Now it's time. But nevertheless, at a very subtle level, there is something in there that knows exactly what to do. It knows when to do it, and it knows how to do it. And when the time is right, it does it. It does it. We don't get a sense of struggle, or strain, or a lot of commotion, or fighting, or anything. It just starts growing. It just starts growing. And the vine grows, and it puts out runners, and the runners grow. And it knows how to draw from the soil exactly what it needs, the nutrients, the water, And the best that we as human beings can do is we can learn how to cooperate with that process. We can learn how to pile the dirt around the hill. We can learn how to keep the weeds away so that they don't take nutrients away from the pumpkins. We can learn the right kind of fertilizer that the pumpkins like. But we didn't create that process. We only learned to cooperate with it and how it works. But nevertheless, there's something in that pumpkin, in that process. There's something there that knows exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And it does it. And it's been doing it for thousands and millions of years. It just simply does it. So if we look at things that way, I think we would have to say that growth and abundance are natural. They are a natural, normal part of the universe. And if we step back away and look at the universe as a whole, if we look at life as a whole, we would say, well, it's not just the pumpkins. It's everything. It is everything. Dr. Holmes asks us to consider how many stars there are in the heavens. It's supposed to be cleared in the mountains tonight. And I have this view of the stars from being up in the mountains. When we lived in Denver, we went up to the mountains for a New Year's weekend one year, and we went out on I guess it was a hayride. We went out on a sled ride, midnight sleigh ride. And God, that was cold. It was absolutely cold. It was one of those places that gets down minus 30, minus 40 on a regular basis. Fraser, Colorado. Fraser, Colorado is where we were. And we were out in the pitch dark, and this big sled, maybe a dozen people on it, team of horses, And we had these carriage blankets that weren't nearly a match for the cold. But the stars were incredible. Of course, we were up maybe 10, 12,000 feet. I don't know what the elevation up Fraser is, but we were up there, and away from the light pollution of the big cities, and out in the middle of a clearing, in the middle of the woods. And before they lit the fire, that thank goodness they lit the fire to warm us up, you could just look up, and it was like you could reach out and you could touch a star. The abundance is there. The abundance is natural. Everything that the divine makes, it makes in abundance. So Dr. Holmes asks us to consider, we can't count the stars in the heavens. We pick up a handful of sand and try to count the number of grains of sand in a handful of sand, and we can't. There's too many. There's just too many. And so, somewhere somebody says, for every grain of sand on every beach in the world, there's a star in heaven. And how they would possibly know that, I don't know. But the point is we live in an abundant universe. And if we look at nature before human conditioned mind gets involved with it, it is by its very nature abundant. Everything is in abundance. The bees are in abundance. The fish in the sea are in abundance. The birds in the air are in abundance. The stars in the heavens are in abundance. So we would have to say that abundance is the natural state of the universe, the normal, natural state of the universe. And then we come to ourselves. And here's where we have to decide, does that include us? Are we part of that abundance? Or have we been excluded from that abundance to the degree that we can only partake of that abundance through some material means, through labor, through bartering, through buying, through selling, through planting, all of those means. And I think the world that we live in relates to the latter. But it wasn't always that way. See, it certainly wasn't always that way. Some of the original people, the Native American peoples who lived here, understood the abundance and understood being in the flow of nature. They understood that after a fire came, after so many years, certain plants came, and after a couple more years, other types of plants came, and they understood that cycle of nature. And all they had to do was, from time to time, set a forest on fire, if it didn't burn naturally. And that fire would clear the land, but I'm talking hundreds or thousands of acres of land, not a 5-acre plot. And then because they were so in flow with the way life worked, they knew what was going to start growing when. And they could just harvest it. When the Europeans set out in their boats and started to explore the world, they came to parts of the world that we would say today are a paradise. The people there lived in harmony. If they wanted lunch, they would go pick it off the tree, or they would go down to the lagoon and they would catch a fish. They were in harmony, they were in flow, they were in sync with the abundance of nature. Of course, the Europeans came along with different ideas, that you need to work hard for your money, you need to struggle, you need to go to bed tired. Idle hands are the devil's playground, and those sorts of things. And they turned what had been a paradise, they turned them into plantations that would grow produce and crops that could then be sent back to Europe to make people wealthy. But that's only an idea, you see. That was only an idea. So what we want to do then is we want to go back and ask ourselves, well, if the very nature of the universe is one of abundance, and if we as human beings are not always experiencing the abundance that we now believe we are part of, then why not? Then why not? And I think it's because we can do, first of all, we are required to do something that nature is not required to do. And we can do something that nature is not required to do. There are two parts of it. So again, we come back to nature before conditioned mind. Before conditioned mind has an opportunity to interfere with it. And I want you to think of a baby. When a baby enters this world, a human baby, other babies as well. Many years ago, I trained as a paramedic. I worked on an ambulance. And we had to go through training to become certified to do that. And part of that training was childbirth. What would we as paramedics have to do if we were required to deliver a baby in a home or in the ambulance? And what we were taught is that as the child is born, of course the first thing you do is take your little looks like a turkey plunger, a short turkey plunger. It's got a rubber bulb on the top and a plastic tube. I can't remember the name of it, but you would use that to draw the mucus out of the baby's nostrils and throat, clear the throat, get the passageways open, make sure it's crying. It comes out, it knows, cry, what? Where am I? And it starts crying, which clears the lungs, which had just a few moments before been full of fluid. A miracle in itself. Nature knew exactly what to do, but what we were taught to do is as soon as we receive this little one and we get its airways clear, is to give it to the mother to nurse. Because so doing not only helps the baby, but it helps the mother. It helps the mother to pass the placenta. Now here's this tiny little creature, this tiny little baby, just a few minutes old, been living in this environment of the womb for months, been growing, been developing. Every cell was coming into place at the perfect time, and some became bones, and some became eyes, and some became little lungs, and some became a heart, and some became blood, and all that. Who taught it to do that, you see? Think of the abundance of cells that are there within that little one. And then it comes into the world, and within just a couple of minutes of being born, it knows how to nurse. It doesn't stop and say, I don't know if I'm worthy to do this. I don't know if that's for me. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I know how to do it. I'm not sure that I'm smart enough to do it. See, all of the things that human beings tell ourselves. But the little one just naturally accepts it's good without reservation. It just naturally accepts it's good. So I think there's two things that I think that are required of us is, first of all, we have to accept. We are told in New Testament theology, we're told it's done unto you. We're told that Spirit, the Father in heaven, Spirit, divine love, God, whatever way you wish to think of this, before you ask, it knows. It knows what you need. But you must ask believing in your heart. And then you'll have it. Then it shall be so. So if divine love already knows, why do we have to ask? And we have to ask because that is an active act an active participation of receiving. See, the pumpkins don't have to ask. The pumpkins just accept. But for us, acceptance must be a conscious act, a spiritual act. And many times we do it with a blessing, to recognize that it comes from God. The gifts we are about to receive, the gifts that we have received, the gifts that we are receiving, these are all a blessing from God. So we must accept the good as easily and as naturally as the pumpkin seed accepts the minerals of the soil, as easily as a baby, a newborn baby, accepts its mother's milk. We must trust this universe that we live in. We must trust that we are part of it. And the other thing that we can do that the pumpkin can't do is we can reject. So maybe it's two sides of the same coin, We must stop not only stop rejecting, but we must consciously accept. We must accept our own nature. We must trust our own nature. We must embrace authentically who we are. Can you imagine the pumpkins, they start growing and they put out a vine, and the flowers come and then the fruit comes, and at night when we all go to bed and the pumpkins talk to one another out there, they look over at the corn stalk and they say, "Hey, what's that?" The corn is growing up on this stalk. It's not laying on the ground where we are. We need to figure out how to grow a stalk. We need to start growing on stalks so that we can be like the corn. See, the pumpkins can't compare themselves. They're just pumpkins. They just do what pumpkins do. They grow on a vine. They lay on the ground. Can you imagine a 2,200-pound pumpkin trying to grow on a corn stalk? Not only would the stalk bend over, but if it was able to stand for any length of time, it might collapse and the pumpkin would smash open. The pumpkin can't analyze things that are coming in. It can't say, "Well, gee, I don't know if this water's for me. I don't know if I should take this water. I don't know if I should accept this water. What about the sunlight? If I take the sunlight, will somebody else not be getting the sunlight?" All the mental conditioning that we as human beings put into place. I can't take this because I didn't work hard for it. It was a gift, and I can't accept that gift. See. So what we have to do is we have to stop and back up and say, wait a minute. I am a part of this abundant universe. Divine love has created me out of itself to partake. And not to abuse, not to misuse, not to hoard. Pumpkins don't hoard. But to partake of this thing called life. It has provided me with everything that I need in order to fulfill its life. What do you need the most to live? What is the most important thing you need to live? And it's air. And yet you can't hoard it. I dare you, take a breath and try to not let it go. What happens? Well, after a couple minutes, you are compelled to exhale. Life is saying to you, you can't hoard life. You have to let it flow through you. You have to take in the air that love has given you, and you have to breathe out the air to the plants, because you are part of the cycle of life and you are part of sharing. Now, it is very, very difficult sometimes for people to understand, how does this relate to the finances in my life? Because we are so conditioned to thinking of money as a transaction that comes to us in exchange for something else, something we sold or something we did, labor, and those kind of things. And where we start is by breaking that identification. Instead of thinking of money as only being a transaction, a transactional thing that comes into our life, what we can do is awaken from our unconsciousness that allows us to sleep in that. And we can start recognizing that the money that comes into our life is nothing more than a visible reminder, a symbol that we are part of the abundance of life. This is spiritual energy coming to me in the form of a paper dollar. I use it wisely, I bless it. It goes forward, it multiplies. It blesses everyone whom it touches. And if we just start to make that simple shift in attitude, to make the recognition on a daily basis of the abundance of life, the food that we eat, you know. I'm amazed sometimes at the selection of food when I go to the grocery store. The food that we eat is part of the abundance of life. The air that we breathe is part of the abundance of life. The water that we drink is part of the abundance of life. And of course, in the last couple of months, we saw more than abundance coming down in the storms. But nevertheless, it's part of the abundance of life. We want to break our identification with the being only human, and things have to come to me in the human way because that's the way I expect them, right? Remember, what you expect and accept as normal, that's what you believe. That's what you believe. And it's done unto you according to your belief. So what we want to try to do is we want to kind of move ourselves into a spiritual realm of saying everything is spiritual no matter how it comes to me. You know, surely we understand that if you put a pumpkin seed in the ground, when the temperature is right, when the moisture is right, it'll germinate, it'll sprout. We can understand chemically the process. But just because we understand that process doesn't take away the fact that it is nature expressing itself abundantly. We don't want to get lost in the details. We want to feel that magic. We want to feel that mysticism. We want to feel the presence of the divine and the hand of divine in everything. And we want to bring that into our financial affairs. See, the pumpkin can't look at the water and say, this is not part of life. This is not good. This is something separate from what I am, and reject it. And yet we can do that. We can do that with the very good that the divine tries to give to us, to offer to us. That's why there's this great struggle, there's this love-hate relationship that we have in our society with the money that we need to live. You know, we say, well, it's dirty, it's evil. The only people who have it are bad people and greedy people and all these things. And these are human ideas. These are human ideas that we project upon these things. And that's true. I mean, it's true in some cases it's true. People do wicked things in order to get money. They do terrible things based on the idea of lack and limitation, based on where they're coming from. And what we want to do is we just want to simply break that identification and say, well, that can be true. If human beings establish their dominion by setting up those rules in their consciousness, that will be true for them. But I want to live by a different set of rules. And right now I'm going to start to realize that every resource that comes to me, whether it be in the form of money or in the form of food or in the form of love or the form of gifts, the form of friendship, all of those things are symbols of the divine abundance flowing through my life. Everything that pumpkin seed needed has been provided. It accepts freely. It takes that gift, it multiplies that gift, and it spreads that gift further. Start to think of your own life in those terms. Start to think of your own life as being a dispenser of love. A dispenser of love. we are capable of becoming aware of this experience of unity, which is what I call love, this oneness. We can let it grow within us, and we can share that with one another, And then we have to trust our nature. We have to trust our nature that as we seek first the kingdom of heaven, which is the presence of the divine within, everything required will be added unto us. Immediately the intellect says, but how? And the ego says, but I've got to struggle for it. And the Spirit says, trust. Open your eyes. Look for it. So today what we do is we invite ourselves to, number one, consciously choose and consciously accept, declare the good that we will have in our lives, to recognize that we are part of the abundance and we don't have to force it to happen. We have to get our own bloated nothingness, to quote Emerson, out of the way. And we accept our good and we recognize it at every appearance in our lives. So this day, as you go forward, bless all of the good as it appears in your life. Bless it as you send it on its way to others. Stop and look at the abundance of leaves. My goodness. I'll be out there with the leaf blower later in the week, blowing it up into mounds, putting it into the compost piles, making fertilizer for next year. If you live in an environment where there are trees with nuts on them, acorns, walnuts, watch them come down in abundance. Watch the squirrels as they run around and accept them, The squirrels don't have a bit of problem accepting. Try to put a bird feeder in your yard. They say, oh goody, it's ours. Catch nature being nature. Stop by the pumpkin patch. Watch the children at play. Catch nature being nature. And then bring yourself into harmony with that. We are one with that. Awaken from the dream. Break the misidentification. You are a beautiful expression of divine life. Everything has already been provided, except your good. And so it is.